Hi people. So today I'm going to be teaching you how to code this website. It's going to be very helpful in your hackathon because we're going to be going over the basics of HTML, CSS, and JS. So basically what this website does is that you can click the add button to add a number, subtract button to subtract a number. So overall it's very straightforward, but there is still a lot to learn from this application. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open a blank project. I'm using CodePen, but you can use anything you want like REPL or VS Code. Doesn't really matter as long as you can see what you're building and you can code in HTML, CSS, and JS. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is start in the HTML. And in the HTML, whenever you want to create an element on the screen, that's when you're going to use HTML, because HTML is the basic like structure of the website. So it would be like the text on the screen or the images or the video. So let's say that you wanted to put that really bold like header on the top. So this would be like this really bold text that you see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an H1 and then I'm going to close an H1. So what this basically means is that H1 stands for header 1. That's like the largest like text size that you have in HTML. And whenever you have HTML on the screen, you're going to want an opening tag and a closing tag. So anything in between is the text that's actually the header. So if I put like a 0, now you should see like 0 is popping up because that we put 0 in between the header tags. So HTML knows that that should be a header. So now I'm just going to be adding in those like different tags. So basically we have the number and we have 2 buttons. So in order to create a button, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put button, very straightforward, and I'm going to write add. And then I'm going to copy this, paste this below. Oh, without that. And then create a subtract button. And here we have 2 really nice buttons on our screen. So that's like the main HTML that you're going to need for this project. But you're going to see here that what we want to do is that we want to align all of this like centered in the middle of the screen. And in order to do that, it's going to be really convenient for us to basically group these two. So what we can do is that we can group the add and subtract button together. So basically like whenever you move any of the buttons around and move the other one with it, so they're like united together. And then we can just center everything in the middle because it's center that group in the middle and then it'll center each one in the middle. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to group those two together. And the way you're going to do that is just by putting a div around it. So divs are basically just like groups. They don't actually add anything. You can see here that the code looks the exact same, but it's just grouping them together. Okay, so now I'm going to add some functionality to my code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my JavaScript. So that's what JS stands for, and that's the actual like functionality behind your app. So you're going to see here that the main functionality is that like this like header here, it's a number, and then you're adding and subtracting from that number. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable using let num equals to 0. So a variable is basically a stored value so that you know it's going to change. For example, like my name is Isha. That's going to be a constant, which basically means that like that value never changes. But if I have, let's say, a jar full of cookies and I'm eating cookies from this jar every day, the amount of cookies in that jar is staying the same. So that would be a variable because the amount of like its value, like the cookies in the jar, is changing. It's variable. So the way to create that variable is by doing a let. the name of the variable. So the name of the variable can be anything, like that is a valid variable name. I'm just going to do num, and then you're going to have to set it equal to something. So I'm just going to set it equal to 0. Okay. So there's no way in HTML or JS to be like, well, you want the value of this header to be equal to the variable. So I'm just going to do like num, or I'm just going to do num. Like, that's not going to work because you can see here that it's just going to write that value. So we're going to have to approach this a different way. And the way that we're going to do that is that we're going to create a function. So a function is an event that happens whenever you run something. Like, for example, if it starts raining outside, the function that you're going to do might be grab an umbrella. So that would be opening maybe your closet door, grabbing the umbrella, taking it out, opening the umbrella, and then going outside. So in this instance, the functions that we want to create is we want to create two. We want the first function to be when you click the add button, and the second function to be when you click the subtract button, because we want something to happen. We want the variable at the top to either add or subtract by 1, depending on which button we're clicking. So I'm just going to write a function that will say it's a function, add, parentheses, and then these curly braces. So what this is saying is that you created a function. The function name is add, so this can be whatever you want, but I'm just going to write add because it's very easy to know what the function is doing. It's nice to have like variable names that are like descriptive of what their purpose is, because if you give this code to someone else, it's very easy for them to read your code. So function add is equal to the parentheses. The parentheses won't really matter in our example here today, but you can basically pass parameters inside. So what that means is it'll basically run the same commands, but it'll change what's being done. So for example, let's say that you wanted to say something. So function say something, and then let's say you speak out loud, but whatever you say will change. So what I can do is I can put in a parameter that says like text, and then you'd speak out loud whatever that text is. So if that text was hi, then you'd say hi out loud. If that text was hello, then you'd say hello out loud. So that's basically what a parameter is, but that's not really important here. And the curly braces basically indicate that everything inside the curly braces is a part of the function. So you can see here that there's this very similar notion with the HTML, which has like the opening and closing tag. There's like that opening and closing curly braces. Okay, so in the add function, obviously we want to add 1 to the number. There's many ways we can do this. The probably most straightforward way that you would know is that num is equal to num plus 1. So we want to take the current value of our variable, we want to add 1 to it, and then we want to set it back to the variable. You can do this, but JavaScript has an even more condensed way of writing it, because you're writing num like again. So you can also write plus equals 1. So this is the exact same thing. The code is very equivalent. And in instances where you're just adding 1, JavaScript has an even more condensed command called plus plus. So everything that I just wrote is the same command. You can use whatever you want, but I'm just going to write this one. And then I'm just going to create another command, subtract num minus 1. Cool. But you're going to see here that if I click these buttons, A, they're not doing anything. And B, they're not like updating this number. So that's because we haven't actually told these buttons to update, like tell these functions to run when these buttons are clicked, and we haven't actually told this header to be equal to the value of this variable. So the first problem I'm going to fix is the fact that this header is not equal to the variable. So in order to fix that, it's going to be a little bit hard, but you'll be able to do it. So the first thing that we want to do is that inside this header, we're going to want to add ID equals, and this can be whatever you want it to be, H1 tag, for example. So an ID, basically like your school ID, like every person at your school will have a different number that's associated with them. So similarly, I'm setting an ID to this tag. It basically means that if I had like any other element should have its own unique ID. So if I wanted to access only this element, I can use its ID because it's unique. Like if I wanted to like talk to you, I'd use your name because it's unique, or your student ID. So this is a unique way of identifying the specific tag. So what we can do is that in the JavaScript, we can actually access this ID. So I can be like document.get element by ID h1 tag. So it doesn't actually matter what text is in here and what text is in here, as long as they're the exact same. And this code, document.getElementById, it's basically looking through all of this HTML and seeing if it can find something with this ID. And like hopefully, if you did it right, there's only one, because only one element can have an ID, because IDs should be unique. So what you're going to do is that you're going to say dot inner HTML. So what that's going to do is it's going to get this 0 here. So it's basically going to get anything that's inside between the opening and closing tag. And we're going to set that equal to the variable. So what that basically means is that we're going to get the like header. We're going to get its text, and then we're just going to set that equal to the variable. And then you're going to want to just copy paste this code into the subtract function, because we already changed the variable. So it does like we should be setting it equal to the variable anyways. But like I mentioned before, the buttons still don't do anything. And that's because you actually have to make sure that when you click this button, it triggers that specific function. So all you're going to want to do is inside that opening tag of button, you're just going to write on click. So that basically means that when this button is clicked, you are going to run the add function. So like I said before, the name of the functions don't actually matter as long as they're the same. And then this one here should also be subtract. Cool. So now if you actually click add and subtract, add will add the number and subtract will subtract the number. Okay, so now we actually have all of the functionality of our application, but you're going to see here that this obviously looks a lot more aesthetic. So we're going to want to make it look pretty. So in order to make it look pretty, the first thing you're going to notice is that this has a background. So in HTML, or just like anywhere in general, there's multiple ways to identify colors. So colors can be your traditional colors, red, green, blue, etc. But that might change. Like you might want a specific shade of red, you might want a specific shade of blue. So what you're going to want to do is that typically I go to color picker on Google. It's really nice because you can drag and you can find a very specific color. And then they have different ways of representing the number. They have a hex code and they also have RGB. It's very easy, I think, to just use the hex value, but honestly it doesn't matter. So let's say that I wanted like this very light purple. I'm going to copy it and then I'm going to come back here. So in order to actually change the color, you're going to want to get the you're going to get all the HTML. So you have to get the entire web page. And in order to just get all the HTML, like everything on the website, you're just going to want to do HTML. That's like the outermost tag that's automatically put into your code when you're coding. So I'm just going to set background color to the hex value. So to break this down a little bit more, the way CSS is structured, CSS is cascading style sheets. And that's basically just styling your application, and you're just going to want to put the tag in. Or you can also style like IDs and classes. We haven't talked about classes, but we will get to it a little bit later. You just put that name in, you put the curly braces, and anything within the curly braces are like properties and things that are modifying or styling that outer tag. So background color is an example of something we can style. So I'm just going to write that, colon, that color name, and then I'll modify the background you can see here to be purple. So I also want this to be like very big and in the center. So I'm going to get the H1 tag. And first, I want the text to be in the center. So you can be text align center. So text align center would basically mean aligning your text to the center. This is exactly like in a Word document, and you can see that it's in the center now. I want the color. You can change the color to be whatever you want. Maybe I want it to be purple. Maybe I want it to be like this very, very dark purple. So I'm just going to copy it. Obviously, this is very up to your stylistic choices. And when you're coding an app, you want to consider the colors that are suited towards your project and towards your target audience. Like, for example, if you're making an app on red-green color blindness, obviously you're not going to use red and green on your website or your app. But yeah, just be mindful. And then I want the font size to be bigger. So in HTML, oh, that's really big. We use pixels to denote size. There's different other measurements, but today we're going to be using pixels, and pixels are basically like on your screen. If you zoom in and zoom in really, really closely, there's just a lot of like squares that create your screen, and one individual square is called a pixel. So I'm just saying that's going to be 100 really, really tiny pixels tall. All right, so now I want to style the buttons. So first I want my button. I want the text inside the button to always remain centered. So I'm going to say text align is center. I want the buttons to have like curved edges. I don't like the fact that it's very like strict and sturdy. So I'm just going to do border radius, maybe like 10 pixels. And it's just going to curve it a little bit. You'll see on the bottom. I'm just going to change the view. Yeah, that's a little bit better. Okay. Yep. Okay. The next thing I want to do is I want to change the color of the buttons. So we already did this command, but that'd be background color. I actually might want to use the same color as I did for my header, but I do think that's a little dark. So maybe, oh, oops. Maybe if I do like this, and then I change both of these. All right. Okay, now you can't see the text inside the button, so I'm just going to make the color white. Okay, cool. I don't like how the buttons are really squished, so I'm just going to set the width to be 100 and the height to maybe be 50. The height is a little too tall. I'm just going to do 25. Okay, maybe 35. I want the buttons to be fully curved, so I'm going to increase this. Okay. All right, I think that looks pretty good. Maybe I'll increase the size, the font size of the text a little bit. So I'm just using all of these so that you become a little bit more familiarized with some of the CSS options that you have. But if you want the full guide, I would go to w3schools.com. W3 Schools is very extensive in CSS and also HTML and JavaScript. But you can see here if you want like gradient backgrounds or like different sort of things, this is really good, but this is just like a introduction. All right. Cool. I think that looks pretty good. Something that you might notice here, if I remove the background color, is that you're going to notice that there's automatically some border around your buttons. And the way to remove that, let me just comment this out real quick so that you can see the changes as I'm making them a little bit easier, is that you have to do border is none, because border automatically adds a border around it. If you actually wanted the border, you just wanted it to be something different, you could do like 3px solid red. That'd create a 3-pixel thick red border. But I'm not really into the borders. I'm just going to remove it. And then I'm going to bring back my background color. All right. And then the very last thing is that I don't like how these buttons are on the side, and I want it to be centered in the header. So if I go back to my HTML, you're going to notice that I added the div around it. And this is where we're going to be using the div, because we can just center the div in the middle so that these buttons remain side by side, but the div is centered in the middle. So in order to do that, you can do an ID just like we did before, because maybe I'll write centered to be more descriptive, because there's only one div with this property. But like for the sake of teaching you something else, and also if we had like multiple buttons that all needed the same thing, I'm just going to use something called a class. So a class is the same way, similar to an ID, where it's a way of identifying a specific tag, but class is when the same class can be used for multiple objects. So for example, if I had maybe a set of another 2 buttons, this would be okay because 2 classes are like 2 separate tags can have the same class. So all right, so if I wanted to style like an ID in HTML, let's say I wanted to change this H1 to only style this specific ID, I would do hashtag means ID, and then the name of the ID. So you can see here that that does the exact same thing. But if I wanted to style, let's say this class, for example, then you do a dot means class, center. And then I'm just going to text align center, and that should bring the buttons to the middle. I don't like how the buttons are like right next to each other. So maybe I'm going to add a margin. So let me pull up a diagram. Okay. So when you're taking a look at like the sizing of objects, first you're going to have the content within the box. But within that specific element, you can add something known as padding. So I think this will actually be easier if I'm using like a button for you to see. So I'm going to remove the height and width property for now. And you're going to see that we have that text inside the button, but it's very squished on the outside. So if I wanted to add a little bit more space, I would add a padding. So padding is the space between the actual text or what's inside the element to the outside of the element. So the next, or you can modify margin. So let's say 100 margin. The margin is what's outside. the element. So you can see here that it didn't change what's inside this element, but it increased the space between the two elements because a margin increases space between elements. So I'm just going to bring back my width and height, and then I'm just going to add maybe a small margin. So now that there's some space between my buttons, and you can see here that it has all the functionality that I need to. So this is a little bit of a deep dive into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Hopefully this is helpful in your project, and definitely check out the resources that I talked about throughout the video. So good luck on your hackathon.